So this question says determine all vertical and horizontal asymptotes of the function g of x. We find vertical asymptotes by setting our denominator equal to 0. So I'm going to just say d or den for denominator. We set it equal to 0. And then if it doesn't cross out, and it'll make more sense in a second. Cross out. Then VA for vertical asymptote. Horizontal asymptotes are found by comparing the biggest exponent in the numerator to the biggest exponent in the denominator. Okay, and then here are some rules. If those, once you compare them, if they are the same, then the horizontal asymptote is the ratio. If the numerator is, if the highest exponent in the numerator is bigger than the highest exponent in the denominator, then it does not exist, right? The horizontal asymptote does not exist. If the denominator has the bigger exponent, then the horizontal asymptote is at 0. So there's a few steps. So our first step is we actually want to find the horizontal asymptote first before we do anything to the question. Then after we figure out what that horizontal asymptote is, we want to simplify our function and see if we can cross out. And then step 3, we want to find the vertical asymptote by setting whatever didn't cross out in the denominator equal to 0. So let's do the first step. So the biggest exponent in the numerator is 8. The biggest exponent in the denominator is 7. That makes the numerator greater than the denominator, which means that there is not a horizontal asymptote. The horizontal asymptote does not exist in this question. That could be potentially enough to answer this question. So let's see. This says no horizontal asymptotes, and this one also says no horizontal asymptotes. So technically, if we're just playing process of elimination, that would mean 1, 2, and 3 have to be gone, just based upon that one rule there. So second of all, I want to simplify. So I take my 4x to the 8th power plus 36 x to the 7th plus 56x to the 6th over 5x to the 7th plus 25x to the 6th. Can I simplify the numerator? Is there a greatest common factor? There definitely is. The largest number that goes into each number in the numerator is a 4. The exponent, the variable with the smallest exponent that goes into each thing there is 6, so this becomes 4x to the 6th. What's left over inside parentheses is 4x to the 6th will be times x squared here, and then I'm going to have a 9x here, and 4 times 14 is my 56x to the 6th. Again, I know that just because if I were to redistribute this, I'd get right back to my original. So that's how I know that I factored that correctly. And then in my denominator, my greatest common factor is 5x to the 6th power. And inside parentheses would have a x and then a plus 5. And again, the same rules. If I distributed this back, I get right back to my original denominator. I can simplify this further. I'd have 4x to the 6th. I can factor the trinomial inside parentheses. There are two numbers that multiply to equal 14 and add up to 9. Those two numbers are 7 and 2, which means this would turn into x plus 7 times x plus 2. And then for my denominator, I've already factored it out, right? So that's all I have, 5x to the 6th and then x plus 5. So here's where I'm looking to see, can I cross anything out? It's part of my simplify step. Is there anything I can cross out? Well, there absolutely is. I could cross out this x to the 6th power. So that's gone and that's gone. Okay. And then with what's left over, I can now find my vertical asymptote by setting what's left over in the denominator, this 5 parentheses x plus 5, equal to 0. I can divide both sides by 5. So I have x plus 5 equals 0. And then I can subtract 5 from both sides, and I get x equals negative 5. So I expect to have a vertical asymptote at x equals negative 5. So given what's left over that I hadn't crossed out, the answer must be this one, because it says I have a vertical asymptote at negative 5, and I have no horizontal asymptotes. Whereas the first one said I had a vertical asymptote at 0 and negative 5, which I don't. You would get a 0 if you could not cross out this x to the 6th. So that's why the crossing out thing is very important. It's also why we leave the vertical asymptotes at the end, after the simplification step, after the crossing out as part of that simplification step. So we don't get confused by thinking that we set this entire thing equal to 0. We always look to cross out first so that things can be taken out, and we'll know then that only what's left over should be set to be equal to 0 to solve for our vertical asymptote.